Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hey everyone. Now we are going to do a video presentation on the origin of species. Our groups consist of Alia, Arija, Fidela, Ginaya, Indah, and myself, Khalil. We are making this video presentation to fulfill the assignment for English for biology class. And in this video, we will talk about the origin of species. In biological species concept, it is emphasized reproductive isolation. What is species? The word species is Latin for kinds or appearance. In daily life, we commonly distinguish between various kinds of organisms. Dogs and cats, for instance, from difference in their appearance. But our organism truly divides into the discrete units we call species, or this classification and arbitrary on the natural world? To answer this question, biologists compare not only the morphology or different groups of organisms, but also less obvious difference in physiology, biochemistry, and DNA sequence. The result generally confirm that morphologically distinct species are indeed discrete groups, differing in many ways besides their very form. Biological species is a group of population whose individuals have the potential to interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring with each other but not with members of other species. Thus, the members of biological species are united by being reproductively compatible, at least potentially. All human beings, for example, belong to the same species. A businesswoman in Indonesia may be unlikely to meet a dairy farmer in Thailand, but if the two should happen to meet and mate, they could have viable babies that develops into fertile adults. In contrast, humans and chimpanzees remains distinct biological species, even where they share territory, because many factors keep them from interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. That's why the biological species concept is based on the potential to interbreed rather than on physical similarity. What holds the gene pool of a species together? The answer is gene flows. The absence of gene flow plays a key role in the formation of new species, as well as in keeping them apart once their potential to interbreed has been reduced. Because biological species are defined in terms of reproductive compatibility, the formation of a new species hinges on reproductive isolation. These barriers can be classified according to whether they contribute to reproductive isolation before or after fertilization, pre-zygotic barrier or before the zygotes, and post-zygotic barriers after the zygote. Example for pre-zygotic barrier is two species of garter snakes in the genus Tamnopes occur in the same geographic area, but one lives mainly in water, while the other is primarily terrestrial. An example for post-zygotic pair is Some salamander subspecies of the genus Ensatina live in the same region and habitats, where they may occasionally hybrid, but most of the hybrids do not complete development, and those that do are frail.
Okay, I will talking about prezygotic barriers. Prezygotic barriers block fertilization from occurring. It means anything that prevents mating and fertilization is a prezygotic mechanism. Habitat isolation, behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, mechanical isolation, and gametic isolation are all examples of prezygotic isolating mechanism. The next, postzygotic barriers. Postzygotic barriers is a mechanism that blocks reproduction after fertilization and zygote formation. It means postzygotic barriers may contribute to reproductive isolation after the hybrid zygote is formed. Okay, talking about hybrid. What is hybrid inviability? Hybrid inviability is a situation in which a mating between two individuals creates a hybrid that does not survive past the embryonic stage. The next, I will explain about exploring reproductive barriers, especially for prezygotic barriers. There are many examples of prezygotic barriers. The first is habitat isolation. Two species that occupy different habitats within the same area may encounter each other rarely, if at all, even though they are not isolated by obvious physical barriers, such as mountain range. The example is two species of garter snakes in the genus Thamnosis. Both of them occur in the same geographic areas, but one lives mainly in water while the other is primarily terrestrial. Okay, for the next example of prezygotic barriers will be explained by my friend Arija Kosasi. To Arija Kosasi, time is yours.
Thanks for Alia. Now I will explain about temporal isolation and behavioral isolation. Temporal isolation. Temporal isolation is when species that are able to interbreed but do not occur because different species breed at different times. Species that breed during different times of the day, different seasons, or different years cannot mix their gametes. Temporal isolation tends to make animals have the same characteristic. For the example about temporal isolation, you can look at this picture. This picture, in the north of America, the geographic range of the western spotted skunk, or we can call Spilogale gracilis, mates in late summer, and the eastern spotted skunk, or we can call Spilogale putorius, mates in later winter. For another example that I know is the cricket Gryllus pennsylvanicus and G. felleti. Both of these animals sexually mature in the different seasons, one in spring and the other in autumn. And in the species Pinus radiata and Pinus muricata, both will never be able to cross-fertilize because reproductive maturity of Pinus radiata occurs in early February and Pinus muricata occurs in late April. Behavioral isolation. Behavioral isolation is two animals that cannot mate because of differences behavior in attracting the attention of the opposite sex, so that they will separate into different species. Courtship rituals that attract mates and other unique behaviors to a species are effective reproductive barriers, even between closely related species. Such behavioral rituals enable mate recognition, a way to identify potential mates of the same species. The example about behavioral isolation, you can look at this picture. This picture is blue-footed boobies. Blue-footed boobies only mates after display unique to their species. Behavioral isolation generally occurs in bird and fish, but can occur in other animals, such as certain cricket. Certain cricket will only mate with males that produce a mating or certain mating song. So that's my explanation. For further explanation will be explained by my friend Fidela Nur Aziza.
Okay, the next part is mechanical isolation. The last part that is included in the prezygotic barriers is mechanical isolation. Prezygotic barriers block fertilization from occurring. Such barriers typically act in one of three ways. 1. By impeding members of different species from attempting to mate. 2. By preventing an attempted mating from being completed successfully, or by hindering fertilization if mating is completed successfully. On mechanical isolation, mating is attempted, but morphological differences prevent its successful completion. For example of mechanical isolation, you can see on the picture. The cells of two species of snails in the genus Brachypeda spiral in different directions. The cells of the species of snails moving inward to the center, one spiral in a counterclockwise direction, other in a clockwise direction. As a result, the snail's genital openings are not aligned and mating cannot be completed. The next part is post-zygotic barriers. If a sperm cell from one species overcomes prezygotic barriers and fertilizer an ovum from another species, a variety of post-zygotic barriers might contribute to reproductive isolation after the hybrid zygote is formed. For example, developmental errors might reduce survival among hybrid embryos, or problems after birth might cause hybrids to be infertile or might discourage their chance of surviving long enough to reproduce. The next part is gametic isolation. Gametic isolation is included in the post-zygotic barrier. This happens when sperm of one species might not be able to fertilize an other species. For instance, sperm might not to be able to survive in the reproductive tract of females of the other species or biochemical mechanism might prevent the sperm from penetrating the membrane surrounding the other species' eggs. An example of gametic isolation, which will then be presented by Guinea.
Thank you, Fidela. I will handle it from here. The example of genetic isolation. Gametic isolation separates certain closely related species of aquatic animals such as sea urchins. Sea urchins release their sperm and eggs into the surrounding water, where they fuse and form zygotes. It is difficult for gametes of different species, such as the red and purple urchin shown here, to fuse because proteins on the surface of the egg and sperm bind very purely to each other. Next, reduced hybrid viability. The genes of different parent species may interact in ways that impair the hybrid's development or survival in its environment. Reduced hybrid viability refers to a lower potentials to survive for organisms whose parents have incompatible genetics, mostly because these parents married despite being different species. Basically, the products of interspecific crosses can be less capable of surviving to reproduce, resulting in a fewer progeny produced and therefore lower fitness. For example, such progeny could die soon after fertilization or prior to hatching, germination, or birth. Example: some salamander subspecies of the genus Ensatina live in the same regions and habitats where they may occasionally hybridize. But most of the hybrids do not complete development, and those that do are frail. Reduced hybrid fertility. Even if hybrids are vigorous, they may be sterile. If the chromosomes of the two parent species differ in number or structure, meiosis in the hybrids may fail to produce normal gametes. Since the infertile hybrids cannot produce offspring when they mate with other parent species, genes cannot flow freely between the species. Such reduced hybrid fertility can be due, for example, to problems arising within the hybrid during meiosis. The classic example of this phenomenon is the mule, a quite exceptional animal that nevertheless only tends to reproduce about once in a blue moon. For example, the hybrid offspring of a donkey, mule, and hemu. Now some of you may be asking, what is the difference between reduced hybrid viability and reduced hybrid fertility? First, reduced hybrid viability is when the hybrid embryo dies, and reduced hybrid fertility is when the offspring is healthy but usually sterile. Now, some of you may be asking, why can hybrids not reproduce? Mules, hinnies, and other normally sterile interspecific hybrids cannot produce viable gametes because the extra chromosome cannot make homologous pair at meiosis. Meiosis is disrupted, and viable sperm and eggs are not formed. However, fertility in female mules has been reported with a donkey as the father. Next, hybrid breakdown. Some first-generation hybrids are viable and fertile, but when they mate with one another or with other parent species, offspring of the next generation are friable or sterile. The example of hybrid breakdown will be handled by my friends Indah Nuraili.
Thank you, Lee, for giving time and idea. I will give one example of a hybrid breakdown, which is rice blend. Strains of cultivated rice have accumulated different mutant recessive allele etiology in the course of their divergence from a common center. Hybrids between them are vigorous and fertile, but plants in the next generation that carry too many of these recessive alleles are small and sterile. Although these rice strains are not yet considered different species, they have begun to be separated by pozygotic berries. Next, we will discuss about limitation of the biological species concept. What does it mean? The biological species concept has limitation. For instance, it can be applied to organisms known only as fossil or to organisms that reproduce only asexual organisms that reproduce asexually, such as prokaryotes. So, scientists use other species concepts such as the morphological species concept in certain circumstances. Uh, Several other definitions emphasize the unity within a species. There are three types of concept, namely the morphological species, the ecological species, and the phylogenetic species. The morphological species concept characteristic a species by body shape and other structural features. The morphological species concept can be applied to asexual and sexual, and it can be useful even without information on the extent of gene flow. In practice, this is how scientists distinguish most species. Next, the ecological species. The ecological species concept, a species in terms of its ecological needs, the sum of how members of the species interact with the non-living and living part of their environment. For example, two species of salamander may be similar in appearance but differ in the foods they eat or in their ability to tolerate dry conditions. Next, the phylogenetic species. The phylogenetic species concept defines a species as the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor, forming one branch on the tree of life. Biologists trace the phylogenetic history of a species by comparing its characteristics, such as morphology or molecular sequence, with those of other organisms. From the statement expressed by my friend, the conclusion is more than 20 other species definitions have been proposed. The usefulness of its definition depends on the situation and the research question being asked. For our purpose of studying how species originate, the biological species concept, with its focus on reproductive values, and is particularly helpful.